What if I told you that your government has done things so unsettling, so quietly buried, that most history teachers either don't know about them or simply choose not to mention them? What if I told you there are files, real declassified documents sitting in national archives right now, describing operations that sound like they belong in a thriller movie, except nobody wrote the ending? Presidential elections, dirty tricks, secret experiments, poisoned alcohol, staged terror plots. They're all part of the same quiet history running underneath the version we learned in school. Now, before you panic and assume this is some wild conspiracy rabbit hole, let me be clear. Everything in this list is documented, declassified, verified through congressional hearings, lawsuits, whistleblowers, or government reports that eventually saw daylight. This isn't about villains and heroes. Every era, every administration, every political side has its own uncomfortable chapters. This is simply the history that got left out of the textbook, presented calmly, so you can actually process it. So here's what I want you to do. Get comfortable. Dim the lights if you're winding down for the night. This is the kind of history made for slow, quiet listening, the kind where your brain drifts between fascination and rest. And if you want more of these deep dives into the hidden corners of history, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories, and it costs you nothing but a tap. Alright, let's ease into it. 100 secrets. Some small, some enormous, all real. And the very first one takes us back nearly a century, to a quiet county in Alabama, where a promise of free healthcare turned into one of the most disturbing medical betrayals in American history. 1. The 1800 Jefferson-Burr tie. In the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson and his own running mate, Aaron Burr, ended up with the exact same number of electoral votes. Back then, electors didn't vote separately for president and vice president. They just voted for two names, and whoever got the most became president. The system worked fine until two men from the same party tied. Suddenly, the decision fell to the House of Representatives, controlled by the outgoing Federalist Party, the very people who'd just lost. It took 36 rounds of voting and nearly a week of political maneuvering before the House finally settled it. The nation's first peaceful transfer of power almost didn't happen because of a design flaw nobody thought to fix in advance. And speaking of behind-the-scenes maneuvering during that deadlock, Hamilton's decisive House letters. Alexander Hamilton despised Aaron Burr, calling him dangerous and unprincipled in private letters to fellow Federalists. So even though Hamilton had no fondness for Jefferson either, he quietly worked to convince Federalist congressmen to back Jefferson instead of Burr. His argument was essentially that Jefferson was merely wrong on policy, while Burr was a genuine threat to the Republic. Hamilton's lobbying helped tip enough votes to end the standoff. It's a strange footnote, one founding father deciding the presidency should go to his rival rather than risk the alternative. 4 years later, Burr would kill Hamilton in a duel, so this rivalry didn't exactly resolve itself peacefully either. And speaking of flawed systems that shaped early elections, the 3/5 clause. Written into the Constitution in 1787, this clause counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of congressional representation and, by extension, electoral votes. Enslaved people couldn't vote, but their presence still boosted the political power of the states that enslaved them. This gave Southern states outsized influence in presidential elections for decades. Historians widely agree it directly affected the outcomes of several early elections, including Jefferson's own victory in the 1800. It's an uncomfortable mathematical reality baked directly into the founding document, one that quietly shaped American politics until the Civil War forced a reckoning with the amendment that finally erased it. And speaking of fixing flawed systems, the 12th Amendment, after the chaos of 1800 made it painfully clear that combining president and vice president into one vote was a recipe for disaster, Congress moved quickly. Ratified in 1804, the 12th Amendment required electors to cast separate, distinct votes for president and vice president. This simple change prevented a repeat of the Jefferson-Burr tie and ensured running mates from the same ticket wouldn't accidentally compete against each other. It seems obvious now, but it took a genuine constitutional crisis to get there. The amendment remains in effect today, quietly doing its job every 4 years, a reminder that even the founders needed a few rounds of trial and error. And speaking of contested elections settled by unusual means, the 1824 corrupt bargain charge. When no candidate won a majority of electoral votes in 1824, the decision again went to the House of Representatives. Andrew Jackson had won the most popular and electoral votes, but not a majority. House Speaker Henry Clay, who'd finished fourth and was eliminated, threw his support behind John Quincy Adams. Adams won. Jackson and his supporters were furious, calling it a corrupt bargain, a backroom deal that stole the presidency from the people's clear choice. Whether it was genuine corruption or simply how the constitutional process was designed to work remains debated by historians to this day. And speaking of that so-called bargain, Henry Clay's cabinet appointment. Shortly after Adams took office, he appointed Henry Clay as Secretary of State, a position widely seen at the time as a stepping stone to the presidency itself. To Jackson's furious supporters, this looked like undeniable proof of a quid pro quo, a deal made in secret to secure Adams the presidency in exchange for a plum job. Adams and Clay always denied any explicit agreement, regardless of what was actually said behind closed doors. The appearance of impropriety haunted Adams's entire presidency and fueled Jackson's successful campaign 4 years later. Sometimes in politics, perception becomes its own kind of truth. And speaking of Jackson's furious supporters channeling that anger into the next election, the coffin handbills of 1828. As Jackson prepared his rematch against Adams, his opponents dug into his military record for ammunition. During his time fighting the British and various Native American nations, Jackson had ordered executions of soldiers for desertion and mutiny. His opponents printed handbills featuring rows of black coffins, each representing a man Jackson had allegedly executed unjustly. The pamphlets spread through newspapers and were nailed to walls and posts across the country, an early form of viral political attack ads. Jackson's supporters fired back, calling the handbills exaggerated smears against a war hero who'd simply enforced military discipline. The coffins became a lasting symbol of the campaign's brutality, one of the first times American voters saw a candidate's past turned into such stark, visual, mass-produced propaganda. Jackson won anyway, suggesting either that voters saw through the tactic or simply didn't care as much as his opponents hoped. Either way, the coffin handbills set a template for negative campaigning that later generations would refine into an art form, proving that dramatic imagery has always been more persuasive than dry policy arguments, even in an era without television or social media to spread it. And speaking of attacks that went after Jackson's personal life rather than his politics, the 1828 marriage accusations. Decades earlier, Rachel Jackson had married Andrew, while apparently still legally married to her first husband, a mess caused by a delayed divorce that wasn't finalized when everyone believed it was. It was an honest mistake, quickly corrected once discovered, and the couple remarried properly. But in 1828, opposition newspapers resurrected the story, framing Rachel as an adulteress and Jackson as a man who'd knowingly stolen another man's wife. The attacks were relentless and deeply personal, appearing in papers nationwide during the final stretch of the campaign. Rachel, who'd always been sensitive about the scandal, was reportedly devastated by the public humiliation. She died of a heart attack shortly after Jackson's election victory, before he even took office. Jackson blamed his political enemies for her death and never forgave them, carrying that grief and bitterness into his presidency. It's a sobering reminder that long before modern tabloids, American campaigns were already willing to dig up old wounds and drag private citizens into public spectacle, with consequences that could be genuinely tragic rather than merely embarrassing. And speaking of tactics designed to generate visible enthusiasm, before anyone could measure public opinion scientifically, the monster rally. Long before polling existed, campaigns needed a way to demonstrate momentum and prove their candidate was the people's choice. The solution was the monster rally, an enormous, carefully organized public gathering meant to overwhelm observers with sheer numbers. These events could draw tens of thousands of attendees, complete with parades, barbecues, speeches, and music, all designed to generate newspaper coverage suggesting unstoppable popular support. Organizers would transport supporters from surrounding towns and counties, sometimes offering free food or transportation to boost attendance. The spectacle mattered more than substance. A massive crowd photographed or described in print sent a powerful message to undecided voters and wavering party officials. Political operatives understood that perception could shape reality. If enough people believed a candidate had unstoppable momentum, that belief itself could become self-fulfilling. These rallies became a staple of 19th century politics, growing more elaborate with each election cycle. They represent an early recognition of something modern campaigns still rely on heavily, that visible crowds and energetic spectacle can influence voters just as effectively as policy positions, sometimes even more so. And speaking of spectacle overtaking substance, the Log Cabin Campaign of 1840. William Henry Harrison was actually born into a wealthy, well-connected Virginia family and lived in a genuinely grand estate. But his opponents made the mistake of mocking him as an old, feeble man who'd be content to sit in a log cabin drinking hard cider for the rest of his days. Harrison's campaign team saw an opportunity and seized it brilliantly. Rather than deny the image, they embraced it completely, rebranding their wealthy candidate as a humble frontier everyman who understood ordinary Americans. Campaign materials featured log cabins on banners, buttons, and songbooks. Miniature log cabins were built and paraded through towns. The imagery had little connection to Harrison's actual life, but it resonated deeply with voters during a period of economic hardship following the Panic of 1837. It was one of the earliest and most successful examples of image crafting overriding biographical accuracy in American politics, proving that a compelling narrative, even a mostly fictional one, could outperform the truth when voters were eager to believe in a relatable candidate rather than an aristocrat. And speaking of that manufactured frontier image, hard cider symbolism became central to the whole campaign. When a Democratic newspaper suggested Harrison would be happier with a barrel of hard cider and a pension than sitting in the White House, meant as an insult implying he was simple and unambitious, his campaign turned the jab into a rallying cry. Hard cider became the unofficial drink of the entire campaign, served at rallies alongside those miniature log cabins built specifically for parades and public gatherings. Supporters carried cider barrels through the streets, reinforcing the idea that Harrison was a plain-spoken man of the people rather than the wealthy landowner he actually was. The symbolism tapped into something voters wanted to believe, that their candidate understood hardship and lived modestly like they did. It didn't matter that the reality contradicted the message. The campaign understood that emotional resonance could outweigh factual accuracy, especially when delivered through consistent, repeatable imagery voters could see and even taste at public events. This calculated embrace of a mocking insult, turning ridicule into branding, became a textbook example of political jujitsu that later campaigns would study and imitate for generations. And speaking of memorable branding, the first campaign song boom arrived alongside All That Cider and Those Cabins. The 1840 election produced an explosion of mass-produced campaign songs, sheet music, and songbooks distributed to enthusiastic crowds nationwide. The most famous phrase to emerge was Tippecanoe and Tyler too, referencing Harrison's military nickname from his victory at the Battle of Tippecanoe alongside his running mate John Tyler. The catchy rhythm made it easy to remember and even easier to chant at rallies, and it spread rapidly through newspapers, parades, and public gatherings. Musicians and everyday citizens wrote countless variations, turning the slogan into something resembling an early viral hit. It represented one of the first times a political campaign successfully used music as a central organizing tool, rather than just an accompaniment to speeches. The simplicity of the phrase, combined with relentless repetition, helped voters associate Harrison directly with military heroism and folksy charm. This musical strategy proved remarkably effective, contributing to Harrison's decisive victory that November, and it demonstrated something campaigns have never forgotten since. A good jingle can sometimes accomplish what pages of policy proposals simply cannot. And speaking of catchy campaign strategies that didn't always play fair, the 1844 anti-Catholic rumor targeted James K. Polk during one of the most intensely religious campaigns in American history. Whisper campaigns claimed Polk was secretly Catholic, a serious liability in a country where Protestant identity was deeply tied to notions of American values and trustworthiness. The rumors had no basis, in fact. Polk was a Presbyterian, raised in a household with strong ties to mainstream American Protestantism. But truth rarely stopped a useful rumor from spreading, especially in an era when newspapers were openly partisan and fact-checking simply didn't exist. Opposition papers ran with the claims, hoping to stir suspicion among voters who associated Catholicism with foreign loyalty and distrusted immigration from Catholic countries. Polk's campaign had to spend valuable time and energy denying something that was never true in the first place, a frustrating pattern that would repeat throughout American political history. The episode reveals just how easily religious identity could be weaponized when campaigns needed a wedge issue and voters were primed to believe the worst about anyone slightly unfamiliar. Polk won the election anyway, but the rumor lingered as an early example of how quickly false claims about a candidate's faith could spread once they tapped into existing cultural anxieties. And speaking of the 1844 election's complications, the Liberty Party effect showed how a small third party could scramble an otherwise straightforward contest. James G. Birney ran as the Liberty Party's anti-slavery candidate, drawing only a tiny fraction of the national vote overall. But in New York, that fraction mattered enormously. Birney pulled thousands of votes away from Whig candidate Henry Clay, votes that likely would have otherwise gone to Clay given the anti-slavery leanings of many Liberty Party supporters. New York's electoral votes ultimately went to Polk by a narrow margin, and those electoral votes proved decisive in the national outcome. Historians have long debated whether Birney's presence in the race effectively handed the presidency to Polk, a strong supporter of territorial expansion and, by extension, the expansion of slavery into new territories. It's one of the earliest clear examples of a third-party candidate potentially altering a presidential outcome without ever coming close to winning himself. The episode became a cautionary tale that would echo through American elections for generations, showing how votes cast out of principle for a minor candidate could inadvertently help elect the very outcome those voters hoped to prevent, a tension between idealism and strategy that third parties have wrestled with ever since. And speaking of military records becoming campaign battlegrounds, the 1848 Mexican war smear went after Zachary Taylor despite his status as a celebrated war hero. Taylor had led American forces to significant victories during the Mexican-American War, earning the nickname Old Rough and Ready and considerable public admiration. Yet his political opponents still found angles to attack, questioning his tactical decisions, suggesting he'd been reckless with soldiers' lives, and framing certain battlefield outcomes as lucky rather than skillful. Some critics argued Taylor had been promoted more for political convenience than genuine merit, an accusation that stung given how central his war record was to his entire candidacy. The attacks reflected a broader unease about the Mexican-American War itself, which remained controversial among Americans who saw it as an unjustified war of expansion rather than a defensive necessity. Taylor largely stayed above the fray personally, letting supporters handle the political sparring, while he maintained the image of a plain-spoken soldier, uninterested in typical campaign theatrics. The strategy worked well enough. Voters seemed more impressed by his genuine battlefield accomplishments than swayed by opponents trying to reframe heroism as recklessness, and Taylor secured the presidency despite the persistent questioning of his most celebrated credential. And speaking of controversies over who truly belonged in American political life, the Know Nothing movement turned nativism into a genuine political force during the 1850s. Officially known as the American Party, the movement operated with such secrecy that members reportedly answered questions about it by simply saying they knew nothing, hence the nickname that stuck. The movement channeled widespread anxiety about rising immigration, particularly from Catholic countries like Ireland and Germany, into organized political action. Members argued that immigrants and Catholics posed a threat to American institutions, sometimes suggesting divided loyalties toward the Pope rather than the United States. The movement gained surprising traction, electing governors, congressmen, and even influencing mayoral races in several major cities. Their rallies and rhetoric made immigration and religious identity central campaign issues in a way rarely seen before, forcing mainstream candidates to address nativist concerns whether they agreed with them or not. The movement eventually faded as the country's attention shifted toward the deepening crisis over slavery, but it left a lasting template. It demonstrated how quickly organized fear about newcomers could translate into electoral success, a pattern that would resurface repeatedly throughout American political history whenever immigration anxieties ran high. And speaking of political violence spilling directly into campaign rhetoric, the 1856 Canning campaign issue turned a brutal Senate attack into election ammunition. 2 years earlier, Congressman Preston Brooks had beaten Senator Charles Sumner nearly to death with a cane on the Senate floor, retaliating for an anti-slavery speech Sumner had delivered that Brooks considered deeply insulting to the South and to a relative. The attack left Sumner with lasting injuries and became an instant symbol of just how volatile the national argument over slavery had become. By the 1856 campaign, the incident was inescapable. Republican candidates invoked Sumner's bloodied image to argue that Southern aggression threatened not just enslaved people but free speech itself in the halls of government. Southern sympathizers, meanwhile, celebrated Brooks as defending honor against Northern provocation, sending him replacement canes as a show of support. The country was essentially arguing about the same violent event from two completely incompatible moral universes. It's a striking early example of how a single act of political violence could become a rallying symbol for opposing sides simultaneously, each interpreting the same brutal moment as proof that the other side had gone too far and could no longer be reasoned with peacefully. And speaking of tensions escalating toward outright violence, Lincoln's secret journey to Washington in 1861 reflected just how dangerous the political climate had become before he'd even taken office. Reports reached his security team of a possible assassination plot in Baltimore, where Lincoln's train was scheduled to pass through during his journey to the inauguration. Detective Alan Pinkerton, hired to investigate potential threats, concluded the danger was credible enough to warrant drastic changes to Lincoln's public itinerary. Rather than proceeding with his planned schedule, Lincoln quietly boarded an earlier train, traveling through Baltimore at night with minimal fanfare, reportedly disguised in a manner meant to avoid recognition. The change embarrassed some observers and became fodder for critics who mocked him as cowardly for slipping through secretly rather than facing potential danger openly. Others argued the precaution was simply responsible, given the volatile secessionist sentiment already spreading through the South. Whether the plot was as serious as Pinkerton believed remains debated among historians. What's certain is that Lincoln arrived safely, took office amid unprecedented national tension, and within weeks watched the country he'd just begun leading descend into a civil war more devastating than any single assassination attempt could have caused. And speaking of wartime politics creating strange contradictions, the 1864 McClellan peace platform revealed just how divided the Democratic Party had become over the ongoing Civil War. Democrats nominated George McClellan, the former Union General Lincoln had once fired for excessive caution on the battlefield, yet the party convention adopted a platform calling the war a failure and demanding an immediate negotiated peace with the Confederacy. McClellan himself didn't fully agree with this stance. He'd commanded Union troops and genuinely wanted to see the war won, not abandoned through negotiation. This left him in the awkward position of running on a platform that contradicted his own personal views, forced to walk a delicate line between placating the peace faction within his party and maintaining his own credibility as a former military commander who believed in eventual victory. Lincoln's supporters seized on this contradiction relentlessly, portraying McClellan as either dishonest or too weak to control his own party's platform. Voters were left trying to figure out which McClellan they'd actually be electing, the general who wanted victory or the candidate whose party wanted surrender. It's a fascinating early example of how a nominee's personal convictions and his party's official platform could diverge so sharply that the resulting confusion became its own campaign issue entirely. And speaking of battlefield timing shaping political fortunes, Sherman's capture of Atlanta arrived at almost impossibly perfect timing for Lincoln's re-election prospects in 1864. Before that victory, Northern morale had been sagging badly under the weight of enormous casualties and a war that seemed to drag on without any clear end in sight. Lincoln himself reportedly believed he might lose the election, given how war weariness had spread across the Union states. Then, in early September, word arrived that General William Tecumseh Sherman had captured Atlanta, a major Confederate stronghold and railway hub. The news transformed the political atmosphere almost overnight. Suddenly, the war looked winnable again, and Northern confidence surged just as voters began seriously considering their choice for president. Lincoln's campaign made sure the victory received maximum attention, understanding that battlefield success translated directly into ballot box support. McClellan's peace platform suddenly looked far less appealing when victory finally seemed within reach rather than a distant impossibility. Historians generally agree that Atlanta's fall played a significant role in shifting public opinion back toward continuing the war effort. It's a clear example of how military timing, sometimes entirely outside a candidate's control, could dramatically reshape an election that had looked genuinely uncertain just weeks earlier. And speaking of visual media shaping public opinion in ways words alone couldn't manage, the 1872 Greeley cartoons demonstrated just how devastating political cartoons could become in the hands of a skilled illustrator. Thomas Nast, already famous for his biting political imagery, turned his attention to Horace Greeley during Greeley's unsuccessful campaign against incumbent Ulysses Grant. Greeley was an unusual candidate in many ways, a longtime newspaper editor known for eccentric habits, unconventional opinions, and a somewhat disheveled personal appearance that made him an easy visual target. Nast's cartoons exaggerated these qualities mercilessly, portraying Greeley as bumbling, foolish, and fundamentally unfit for the presidency. The cartoons appeared regularly in widely circulated publications, reaching audiences who might never read a lengthy political editorial but would absolutely remember a striking, mocking image. Greeley found himself unable to counter the visual narrative effectively, no matter how substantive his actual policy positions might have been. The relentless caricaturing took a genuine personal toll on him, and some historians have suggested the brutal public mockery contributed to his declining health during and immediately after the campaign. Greeley died just weeks after the election, having lost badly to Grant. It stands as an early and rather harsh reminder that in politics, a memorable image could sometimes overpower substance entirely. And speaking of elections so contested that nobody could agree who'd actually won, the 1876 Tilden-Hayes dispute produced one of the messiest outcomes in American electoral history. Democrat Samuel Tilden won the popular vote outright and appeared to have secured enough electoral votes for victory as well. But returns from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina came back disputed, with both parties submitting competing sets of electoral votes claiming legitimacy. Accusations of fraud and voter intimidation flew from both sides, and honestly, evidence suggests irregularities existed in multiple directions, making it genuinely difficult to determine which results reflected the actual will of voters in those states. The nation found itself in a constitutional crisis of sorts, with no established clear process for resolving competing claims of electoral victory. Tilden needed just one more electoral vote to win outright, while Hayes needed every single disputed vote to go his way. Newspapers speculated about potential violence or even a second civil war if the situation wasn't resolved peacefully. The dispute dragged on for months after the actual election day, leaving the country without certainty about its next president, well into what should have been a routine transition period, forcing Congress to eventually intervene with an unprecedented solution. And speaking of Congress stepping in when the Constitution didn't provide clear answers, the Electoral Commission of 1877 became the unusual mechanism through which America finally resolved its disputed presidential election. Lawmakers created a special 15-member commission composed of senators, representatives, and Supreme Court justices, intended to be balanced between the two parties. The commission was tasked with reviewing the disputed electoral votes from the contested states and determining which set should count. In a pattern that repeated across every single disputed state, the commission voted along strict party lines, awarding all the contested electoral votes to Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes by a margin of exactly one vote each time. This gave Hayes precisely the electoral votes he needed for victory, despite Tilden's clear lead in the popular vote nationally. Democrats were furious, viewing the commission's decisions as a partisan maneuver rather than a genuinely neutral resolution process. Some historians have questioned whether the commission's makeup was ever truly balanced to begin with, given how consistently the votes broke down along party preference. The decision technically settled the immediate crisis, but it left lingering resentment and questions about legitimacy that would shape the political negotiations happening behind closed doors in the weeks that followed. And speaking of behind closed doors negotiations shaping the nation's future, the Compromise of 1877 remains one of the most debated deals in American political history, precisely because historians still argue over what was actually promised and by whom. The general understanding holds that Southern Democrats agreed to accept Hayes's disputed victory in exchange for assurances that federal troops would be withdrawn from the remaining Reconstruction-era Southern states. Hayes took office and did indeed order federal troops out of the South shortly afterward, effectively ending the federal government's active enforcement of Reconstruction policies that had been protecting the rights of newly freed black citizens. Whether this withdrawal was explicitly promised as part of a formal deal or simply happened to align with a broader political shift that was already underway remains genuinely contested among historians. What's clear is the timing and the consequences. Reconstruction's end opened the door to decades of disenfranchisement, segregation, and violence against Black Americans across the South, as former Confederate states moved quickly to establish Jim Crow laws once federal oversight disappeared. The election that nearly caused a constitutional crisis ended not with celebration, but with a quiet, complicated bargain whose full terms may never be completely known, and whose consequences shaped American life for generations afterward. And speaking of compromises with consequences that lingered for generations, dirty tricks in presidential campaigns didn't disappear once Reconstruction ended. They just found new targets. The Maury letter forgery of 1880 proved that fabricated documents could swing an election almost overnight. Someone forged a letter attributed to Republican candidate James Garfield, making it appear he favored unrestricted Chinese immigration at a time when anti-Chinese sentiment ran high on the West Coast, particularly among labor groups worried about job competition. The letter was published just days before the election, spreading rapidly through newspapers eager for a scandal. Garfield denied writing it, and handwriting analysis later supported his claim, but the timing left almost no opportunity for a full public rebuttal before voters headed to the polls. The forgery appears to have cost Garfield some support in California, though he still won the presidency in a very close national contest. The person or people behind the forgery were never definitively identified, leaving historians to speculate about motive and origin. It stands as one of the earliest documented examples of a fabricated document deliberately timed to manipulate an election just before voters could verify its authenticity, a tactic that would echo through American political history for the next century and beyond. And speaking of single remarks capable of shifting an entire election, the 1884 Romanism and Rebellion comment demonstrated how one poorly chosen phrase from a supporter could damage a candidate through no direct fault of his own. At a Republican gathering supporting James Blaine, a clergyman named Samuel Burchard delivered a speech attacking the Democratic Party, characterizing it as the party of Romanism and Rebellion, a phrase widely understood as an insult toward Irish Catholic voters specifically. Blaine was present at the event, but didn't immediately object to the remark, an omission his opponents seized upon relentlessly in the campaign's final days. Democrats quickly publicized the comment throughout heavily Catholic communities, particularly in New York, framing it as evidence of Republican prejudice against Catholic Americans. The election in New York turned out to be extraordinarily close, and many historians believe the backlash from Burchard's remark contributed to Blaine's narrow loss in that crucial state. Since New York's electoral votes ultimately decided the national election, this single sentence from a supporter, not even the candidate himself, may have changed the outcome of the entire presidential race. Blaine reportedly regretted not responding to the comment immediately, a lesson in how silence at the wrong moment can carry as much political weight as anything actually said out loud. And speaking of personal scandals that campaigns turned into weapons, the Cleveland paternity scandal of 1884 tested just how much voters cared about a candidate's private life versus his public qualifications. Grover Cleveland, the Democratic nominee, acknowledged that he had provided financial support for a child born to a woman named Maria Halpin, though the exact circumstances of the relationship remain murky and contested even at the time. Republicans seized on the story with gleeful enthusiasm, chanting, "Ma, Ma, where's my pay?" at campaign rallies to mock Cleveland publicly. Rather than deny the allegations or hide from the controversy, Cleveland took the unusual approach of instructing his advisors to simply tell the truth about the situation, acknowledging his financial responsibility without elaborate justification or evasion. This strategy of transparency, rare for the era, actually seemed to work in his favor, with many voters respecting his willingness to face the matter honestly rather than deny an obvious truth. Cleveland won the election narrowly, and supporters later added their own retort to the chant, noting that he'd gone to the White House regardless. The episode remains a fascinating early case study in how honesty, even about embarrassing personal matters, could sometimes outperform denial as a political strategy. And speaking of forged correspondence designed to inflame ethnic tensions among voters, the Murchison letter scandal of 1888 showed how a single deceptive letter could create genuine international controversy during a presidential race. A Republican operative named George Osgoodby wrote to the British ambassador while pretending to be a British-born American citizen named Charles Murchison, asking for guidance on which candidate would better serve British interests. The ambassador, apparently not suspecting a trap, responded suggesting that Cleveland's re-election would be more favorable to British concerns. Republicans immediately published the response, hoping to damage Cleveland among Irish American voters who harbored deep resentment toward British influence, given Ireland's ongoing struggles for independence. The strategy worked precisely as intended, generating significant anger within Irish American communities and likely costing Cleveland crucial votes in states with substantial Irish populations. The scandal also created a genuine diplomatic embarrassment, forcing the British ambassador to resign his post shortly afterward due to the controversy his response had generated. It remains a rather elaborate example of political operatives manufacturing an entire fake identity purely to manipulate both foreign diplomacy and domestic ethnic voting patterns within the same clever deception. And speaking of leaked letters causing diplomatic headaches during the very same election, the Sackville West letter added yet another layer of international intrigue to the already chaotic 1888 campaign. This letter, connected to the same underlying controversy as the Murchison affair, involved the actual British ambassador's written correspondence being made public in a way that appeared to favor Cleveland's candidacy over Harrison's. Once published, the letter created a firestorm, with critics arguing that foreign interference in American democracy was unacceptable regardless of which candidate benefited. The controversy forced the Cleveland administration into an awkward position, demanding the ambassador's departure to demonstrate that foreign influence wouldn't be tolerated, even though the letter itself hadn't been Cleveland's doing at all. The episode reveals how thoroughly intertwined foreign diplomacy and domestic politics had become, and how quickly a private communication could become public ammunition once campaigns realized its potential value. And speaking of elections that left voters questioning what democracy actually meant, the 1888 popular vote split delivered one of the clearest reminders that America's electoral system doesn't always align with the national popular will. Grover Cleveland received more individual votes nationwide than Benjamin Harrison, yet Harrison secured victory in the Electoral College and became the nation's next president. This outcome stemmed largely from Harrison's narrow but crucial wins in several closely contested northern states, whereas Cleveland's support ran up massive margins in southern states that didn't ultimately translate into additional electoral advantage. Cleveland accepted the loss gracefully despite the frustrating mathematics involved, and remarkably returned 4 years later to reclaim the presidency in 1892, becoming the only president in American history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. The 1888 split renewed long-standing debates about whether the Electoral College truly reflected the nation's democratic preferences or whether it produced outcomes that ran counter to the clearly expressed will of the voting public. And speaking of campaigns that took entirely different approaches to reaching voters, the 1896 Front Porch Campaign showed that sometimes the best strategy was simply staying home. William McKinley, the Republican nominee, conducted much of his campaign from the comfort of his own front porch in Canton, Ohio. Delegations of supporters would travel by train to visit him, sometimes numbering in the thousands on a single day, and McKinley would deliver carefully prepared remarks tailored to whatever group had arrived. This approach allowed him to appear presidential and above the fray while avoiding the exhausting whistle-stop tours his opponent favored. Meanwhile, surrogates and party officials fanned out across the country, carrying McKinley's message to places he never personally visited. The strategy worked partly because it played to McKinley's calm, reassuring public image, contrasting sharply with the fiery barnstorming style of his Democratic rival. Newspapers covered the front porch visits extensively, effectively turning Canton into a pilgrimage site for the politically engaged. The approach also allowed McKinley to control his message with remarkable precision, since every appearance was staged, scripted, and reported rather than left to the unpredictability of live crowds on the road. It proved successful enough that McKinley won comfortably, though the more physically demanding, high-energy campaigning style of his opponent would eventually become the standard that most future candidates felt compelled to follow. And speaking of the people working quietly behind the scenes to make campaigns like McKinley's possible, Mark Hanna's fundraising network represented something genuinely new in American politics. As McKinley's campaign manager, Hanna organized business support on a scale nobody had previously attempted, systematically approaching banks, corporations, and wealthy individuals to fund the Republican effort. He reportedly assessed contributions based on a percentage of each company's assets, treating fundraising less like charity and more like a structured business proposition with clear expectations attached. This approach generated an enormous war chest, dwarfing what Bryan's campaign could hope to raise through smaller, more grassroots contributions. Hanna used the money for pamphlets, surrogate speakers, advertising, and the logistics needed to support McKinley's front porch strategy. Critics at the time worried openly about corporate influence buying elections, arguments that sound remarkably familiar to modern ears more than a century later. Hanna's methods became a template for professionalized campaign fundraising, demonstrating that organized, well-funded operations could overwhelm opponents through sheer resource advantage, rather than relying purely on candidate charisma or grassroots enthusiasm. Some historians consider Hanna the first modern campaign manager, someone who treated politics with the same systematic rigor as running a large business enterprise, forever changing how future campaigns would approach the practical mechanics of winning elections through money and organization. And speaking of moments where a single speech could electrify an entire convention, William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech remains one of the most celebrated pieces of political oratory in American history. Delivered at the 1896 Democratic National Convention, Bryan argued passionately against the gold standard, advocating instead for the free coinage of silver to help struggling farmers and debtors burdened by deflationary monetary policy. His closing lines, declaring that mankind should not be crucified upon a cross of gold, brought the convention hall to a thunderous, prolonged standing ovation. The speech was so effective that it essentially secured Bryan the Democratic nomination on the spot, propelling a relatively unknown 36-year-old congressman into the national spotlight almost overnight. Bryan's populist message resonated deeply with rural voters and struggling farmers who felt the existing gold-based economy favored wealthy Eastern bankers and industrialists over working people. The speech's emotional power and religious imagery made it instantly memorable, quoted and referenced for generations afterward as a masterclass in persuasive political rhetoric. Bryan would go on to run for president 3 separate times, never winning, but his Cross of Gold speech remains studied today as a prime example of how oratory alone can transform a political career and reshape the trajectory of an entire national convention within a matter of minutes. And speaking of the fear-based messaging that followed Bryan's Silver Crusade, the 1896 gold standard panic ads represented an early and remarkably aggressive use of economic anxiety as a campaign weapon. McKinley supporters flooded newspapers and pamphlets with warnings that adopting free silver would trigger runaway inflation, destroy personal savings, and devastate the wages of ordinary workers. Business owners reportedly told employees that a Bryan victory could mean factory closures, sometimes implying, none too subtly, that jobs themselves depended on the election's outcome. These ads painted vivid pictures of economic ruin, worthless currency, and financial chaos should the silver standard replace gold as the nation's monetary foundation. The Republican campaign's substantial financial resources allowed for an unprecedented volume of printed material, distributed widely enough to reach nearly every corner of the country. Some historians view this as one of the first large-scale examples of coordinated economic fear messaging in American political history, a tactic that would reappear in various forms throughout the 20th century. The strategy proved effective, particularly among urban workers and business communities who worried about currency instability affecting their daily financial security. Bryan's supporters countered with their own messaging about the suffering of indebted farmers, but their financial resources couldn't match the sheer scale of the gold standard advertising campaign, which flooded the electoral landscape with warnings of impending economic catastrophe. And speaking of attacks that targeted a candidate's personal associations rather than his actual policies, the 1904 Mormonism attack against Theodore Roosevelt revealed how religious prejudice could surface even against a candidate not personally practicing the faith in question. Roosevelt accepted political support from Mormon voters and leaders in Utah, a state where the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints held considerable political influence. Opponents seized on this connection, suggesting that Roosevelt's willingness to accept such support indicated troubling tolerance or even secret sympathy toward practices many Americans still viewed with deep suspicion, particularly regarding the Church's historical association with polygamy. Critics circulated pamphlets and editorials questioning Roosevelt's judgment for engaging with Mormon political networks at all, framing simple electoral cooperation as something scandalous or dangerous. Roosevelt largely brushed aside these attacks, understanding that broad religious tolerance served his political interests far better than pandering to prejudice. The controversy ultimately had minimal impact on the election's outcome, since Roosevelt remained enormously popular across most demographics. Still, the episode illustrates how religious identity and association could become weaponized in ways only tangentially related to actual policy positions, a pattern that would resurface repeatedly in future elections involving candidates or supporters from minority religious backgrounds. And speaking of slogans that captured an entire campaign's message in just a few simple words, the 1908 Full Dinner Pail slogan helped define William Howard Taft's successful bid for the presidency. The phrase, inherited partly from earlier Republican messaging under McKinley, evoked simple, tangible prosperity, the image of a worker's lunch pail full of food representing steady employment and economic security. Taft's campaign leaned heavily into this imagery, contrasting Republican economic stability against the uncertainty many voters associated with Bryan's continued advocacy for monetary reform. The slogan proved remarkably effective precisely because of its simplicity, requiring no complex economic explanation to communicate its central message of comfortable, reliable prosperity under continued Republican leadership. Taft, handpicked by the popular outgoing President Roosevelt as his successor, benefited enormously from riding the wave of Roosevelt's continued popularity, while offering voters a promise of steady continuity rather than dramatic change. The full dinner pail imagery worked particularly well among working-class voters, who valued predictable employment over abstract monetary theories they may not have fully understood or trusted. Taft won comfortably, demonstrating once again how a well-crafted, easily digestible slogan could sometimes accomplish more persuasive work than lengthy policy explanations ever could among an electorate more interested in tangible outcomes than theoretical economic debates. And speaking of campaigns disrupted by internal party fractures, the 1912 Republican split showed just how much damage a determined former president could do to his own party. Theodore Roosevelt, unhappy with the direction his hand-picked successor William Howard Taft had taken the presidency, decided to challenge him for the Republican nomination. When party regulars sided with Taft at the convention, Roosevelt walked out and formed his own party, taking a substantial chunk of progressive-minded Republican voters with him. This left the Republican vote badly divided between two candidates who agreed on more than they disagreed on, while Woodrow Wilson's Democrats faced no such internal rivalry. The math worked out exactly as you'd expect. Roosevelt actually outperformed Taft, finishing second in both popular and electoral votes, an extraordinary result for a third-party candidate, but the split still handed Wilson the presidency with well under 50% of the popular vote. Taft himself seemed almost relieved by the outcome, reportedly telling friends there were worse things than losing the presidency. The episode remains one of the clearest examples in American history of how a divided party can hand victory to an opponent who might not have won a fair fight against a unified opposition, a lesson that later campaign strategists would study carefully for generations. And speaking of colorful nicknames born from a single offhand remark, the Bull Moose Party earned its name almost by accident during Roosevelt's third-party run. When reporters asked Roosevelt about his health and stamina heading into the grueling 1912 campaign, he reportedly declared that he felt as fit as a bull moose, a phrase meant to project vigor and readiness for the fight ahead. The comment stuck, and soon Roosevelt's newly formed Progressive Party had picked up the nickname permanently, complete with bull moose imagery appearing on campaign buttons, cartoons, and posters across the country. The name fit Roosevelt's larger-than-life public persona perfectly, reinforcing the rugged outdoorsman image he had cultivated throughout his political career. Even after being shot by a would-be assassin during the campaign, Roosevelt insisted on delivering a scheduled speech anyway, bleeding through his shirt while joking that it would take more than a bullet to bring down a bull moose. The nickname outlived the party itself, which dissolved not long after the 1912 election once Roosevelt's political momentum faded. Even so, the Bull Moose Party remains one of the most memorable third-party movements in American history, remembered today as much for its distinctive branding as for the electoral chaos it caused within Republican ranks. And speaking of campaign slogans that didn't quite hold up to what happened next, the 1916 "He kept us out of war" slogan became one of the more awkward promises in presidential campaign history. Woodrow Wilson's re-election campaign leaned heavily on the idea that his steady leadership had kept the United States out of the devastating conflict raging across Europe, a message that resonated strongly with a war-weary electorate, hoping to avoid the bloodshed consuming the continent. Wilson himself was somewhat cautious about the slogan, understanding that circumstances could shift quickly given the volatile international situation, but his campaign surrogates embraced it enthusiastically as a central selling point. The strategy worked well enough to secure Wilson a narrow re-election victory over Republican challenger Charles Evans Hughes. Then, barely a month into his second term, escalating German submarine attacks and the intercepted Zimmermann telegram pushed the United States directly into World War I. The very promise that had helped re-elect Wilson became almost immediately obsolete, a stark reminder of how quickly foreign policy circumstances can outpace campaign rhetoric. Wilson later argued that circumstances beyond his control had forced America's hand, and many historians agree the shift was driven by genuine external pressures rather than any deliberate deception, though the timing remained a striking irony nonetheless. And speaking of narrow losses that came down to remarkably small margins, the Hughes California misstep proved costly enough to potentially change the entire outcome of the 1916 election. Charles Evans Hughes, the Republican nominee challenging Wilson, ran a campaign plagued by scheduling confusion and organizational tension, particularly during a crucial visit to California. Through a mix of miscommunication and poor coordination among his staff, Hughes reportedly failed to meet with the state's popular progressive Republican governor, Hiram Johnson, during his visit, an oversight that some accounts suggest deeply offended Johnson and his considerable base of supporters. Whether intentional slight or simple scheduling accident, the perceived snub created lasting friction within California's Republican coalition at a moment when party unity mattered enormously. California ended up going for Wilson by an extremely narrow margin, a result significant enough that flipping the state would have shifted the entire electoral outcome in Hughes's favor. Historians still debate exactly how much the Johnson incident actually influenced the final vote count, since many other factors were certainly at play as well. Still, the episode remains a frequently cited cautionary tale about how seemingly minor logistical missteps and bruised political egos can sometimes carry consequences far larger than campaign staffers ever intended or anticipated at the time. And speaking of campaigns that deliberately minimize public exposure rather than maximizing it, the 1920 Front Porch Revival brought back a strategy reminiscent of McKinley's earlier approach, this time centered on Warren Harding's home in Marion, Ohio. Following the exhausting national divisions caused by World War I and the bitter fight over the League of Nations, Harding's campaign calculated that voters were craving calm reassurance rather than dramatic rhetoric or aggressive travel schedules. Harding limited his personal travel considerably, instead delivering carefully controlled speeches from his own front porch to delegations who journeyed to see him, much as McKinley's visitors once had decades earlier. This approach allowed Harding's team to manage his public image with precision, avoiding potential missteps that extensive travel and unscripted appearances might have invited. Harding's simple promise of a return to normalcy fit perfectly with this restrained, low-key campaign style, offering voters stability rather than confrontation after years of wartime anxiety and political upheaval. The strategy proved remarkably successful, and Harding won by an overwhelming margin, demonstrating once again that sometimes the safest path to victory involves staying comfortably at home rather than exhausting oneself crisscrossing the country in pursuit of votes. And speaking of candidates who built entire public personas around saying as little as possible, the 1924 Silent Cal image became one of the most distinctive branding strategies in early 20th century American politics. Calvin Coolidge, who had ascended to the presidency after Harding's sudden death, cultivated a reputation for quiet reserve, brief public statements, and an almost stoic demeanor that stood in sharp contrast to the more animated political figures of his era. This carefully maintained image of steady, unflashy competence resonated with voters who associated Coolidge's quiet confidence with economic stability and calm governance. Remarkably, 1924 also marked the first presidential campaign shaped significantly by radio broadcasting, a new medium that rewarded Coolidge's measured, deliberate speaking style far more than it might have suited a louder, more theatrical candidate. His clear, unhurried radio addresses reached homes across the country in a way previous campaigns never could, allowing millions of Americans to hear a presidential candidate's actual voice for the first time in their own living rooms. Coolidge's understated approach and mastery of this emerging technology helped him win comfortably, proving that sometimes the quietest candidate in the room can still speak the loudest when the right medium finally comes along. And speaking of campaigns where a candidate's religion became the central issue rather than his policies, the 1928 anti-Catholic campaign exposed just how deep religious prejudice still ran in American politics. Al Smith, the Democratic governor of New York, became the first Catholic nominated for president by a major party, and that single fact overshadowed nearly everything else about his candidacy. Opponents circulated wild rumors claiming Smith would take orders directly from the Pope, that he'd build a tunnel connecting the White House to the Vatican, that Catholic control of the presidency would somehow end American democracy as everyone knew it. Protestant ministers preached against him from pulpits across the South and rural Midwest, regions that had traditionally voted Democratic but abandoned Smith in droves. Newspapers ran cartoons depicting Catholic conspiracies. Anti-Smith literature flooded mailboxes warning of religious takeover. Herbert Hoover's campaign didn't need to officially endorse these attacks, since plenty of grassroots organizations happily did the work themselves. Smith lost decisively, and while economic factors and Hoover's own popularity certainly played a role, historians widely agree that religious prejudice cost Smith significant support he might otherwise have earned. The episode became a sobering reminder of how personal identity could overwhelm policy debate entirely, a pattern that would resurface decades later when John F. Kennedy faced strikingly similar accusations during his own presidential run. And speaking of political associations that opponents weaponized relentlessly, the 1928 Tammany Hall attacks gave Smith's critics another powerful line of attack beyond religion alone. Smith had risen through New York City's Democratic political machine, Tammany Hall, an organization with a long and complicated history involving patronage, favor trading, and occasional outright corruption scandals stretching back generations. Opponents portrayed Smith as a product of this machine, suggesting his entire political career had been built on backroom deals rather than genuine public service or merit. Rural and small-town voters, already suspicious of big city politics, found this framing particularly persuasive, reinforcing existing stereotypes about urban corruption versus supposedly wholesome heartland values. Campaign materials linked Smith's Tammany background directly to his Catholic faith, suggesting both represented foreign big city influences threatening traditional American life. Smith struggled to separate his personal record of genuine reform accomplishments as governor from the broader reputation of the organization that had launched his career decades earlier. The Tammany Association became shorthand for critics who wanted to attack Smith without explicitly invoking religious prejudice, offering a slightly more socially acceptable line of criticism that still carried the same underlying message. Combined with the religious attacks, these overlapping narratives proved devastating, illustrating how campaigns often layer multiple lines of criticism that reinforce each other even when they're not officially connected. And speaking of physical landscapes that became lasting symbols of political failure, the 1932 Hoovervilles turned Depression-era suffering into an unforgettable visual indictment of Herbert Hoover's presidency. As unemployment soared and homes were lost by the millions, desperate Americans built makeshift shantytowns out of scrap wood, cardboard, and tin across vacant lots in nearly every major city. These settlements needed a name, and struggling residents chose one loaded with bitter irony, naming them directly after the president many blamed for failing to adequately address the crisis. The largest Hooverville sprawled across St. Louis, housing over 1,000 people in conditions that shocked visitors and reporters alike. Central Park in New York City hosted its own Hooverville, situated with grim visibility near some of the city's wealthiest neighborhoods. Hoover himself believed strongly in limited federal intervention, favoring voluntary cooperation between businesses and local charities over direct government relief programs, a philosophy that increasingly seemed inadequate as the economic collapse deepened. Whether Hoover's policies truly caused the Depression remains debated among historians, since global economic forces beyond any single president's control played enormous roles. Still, the Hooverville name stuck permanently in public memory, transforming Hoover from a once celebrated humanitarian engineer into a symbol of governmental inaction during the campaign that ultimately swept Franklin Roosevelt into office. And speaking of new technology reshaping how presidents connected with struggling citizens, FDR's radio strategy transformed the relationship between the presidency and everyday Americans in ways that still influence political communication today. Franklin Roosevelt possessed a warm, conversational speaking voice that translated beautifully over radio waves, allowing him to sound less like a distant government official and more like a trusted neighbor explaining difficult circumstances honestly. His famous fireside chats, though technically beginning after his 1932 election victory, built directly on communication instincts he'd sharpened throughout his campaign, speaking calmly and personally to a nation desperate for reassurance during economic catastrophe. Roosevelt understood that Americans sitting in their living rooms wanted to feel like the president was speaking directly to them individually, not delivering a formal address to some abstract audience. He avoided complicated policy jargon, choosing simple, direct language that ordinary citizens could easily follow regardless of their education level. This approach stood in deliberate contrast to Hoover's more formal, reserved public style, which increasingly seemed disconnected from the suffering millions were experiencing firsthand. Roosevelt's radio mastery helped humanize the presidency itself, creating an emotional bond with voters that proved remarkably durable throughout his unprecedented 4 terms in office. The strategy demonstrated how emerging communication technology could fundamentally reshape political persuasion, a lesson every successful campaign since has studied carefully. And speaking of confident predictions that turned into embarrassing public failures, the 1936 Literary Digest poll delivered one of the most spectacular polling disasters in American electoral history. The respected magazine had successfully predicted presidential winners in previous elections using massive mail-in surveys, building a reputation for reliable political forecasting that readers trusted implicitly. For 1936, the Digest mailed out an astonishing 10 million questionnaires, drawing names from telephone directories and automobile registration lists, sources that seemed reasonably comprehensive at the time. Based on over 2 million responses, the magazine confidently predicted that Republican challenger Alf Landon would defeat Roosevelt decisively. The actual election results proved wildly different, with Roosevelt winning in one of the largest landslides in American history. The catastrophic error stemmed from sampling bias that nobody had properly considered, since phone and car ownership during the Depression skewed heavily toward wealthier Americans who leaned Republican, while poorer voters overwhelmingly supporting Roosevelt were dramatically underrepresented. The disaster effectively destroyed the Literary Digest's credibility, and eventually contributed to the magazine's financial collapse entirely. Meanwhile, a young pollster named George Gallup used smaller, more carefully constructed samples to correctly predict Roosevelt's victory, launching modern scientific polling methods that would reshape American political forecasting for generations afterward. And speaking of campaign rhetoric that sounded almost absurdly exaggerated in hindsight, the 1936 land on the moon rumor captured just how fantastical some criticisms of Roosevelt's expanding government programs had become. As Roosevelt's New Deal dramatically expanded federal power through new agencies, regulations, and public works programs, conservative critics increasingly warned that American government was transforming into something unrecognizable, dangerous, and potentially limitless in scope. Some rhetoric grew so heated that opponents suggested Roosevelt's administration might attempt almost anything, with critics occasionally invoking wildly exaggerated hypothetical government overreach to illustrate their fears about unchecked federal expansion. These claims, whether stated literally or offered as pointed exaggeration, reflected genuine anxiety among businessmen and conservative voters who believed New Deal programs represented a fundamental, perhaps irreversible shift away from traditional limited government principles. Roosevelt's supporters dismissed such rhetoric as fear-mongering, disconnected from the practical relief programs actually helping struggling Americans survive the ongoing economic crisis. The exaggerated language nevertheless reveals something important about how dramatically perceptions of government's proper role were shifting during this period, with citizens on both sides struggling to process changes happening faster than anyone had previously imagined possible. Roosevelt won re-election overwhelmingly despite these warnings, suggesting most voters prioritized immediate economic relief over abstract fears about government expansion, even as debates about the New Deal's proper scope and lasting consequences continued shaping American politics for decades afterward. And speaking of unwritten rules that governed American politics for generations, the 1940 third-term controversy tested one of the most sacred unofficial traditions in the nation's history. George Washington had voluntarily stepped aside after 2 terms, establishing a precedent that every subsequent president had followed for over a century, treating it almost like an unwritten constitutional amendment. Roosevelt broke that tradition entirely, arguing that the escalating crisis in Europe and the ongoing threat of war made continuity of leadership essential for national security. Critics accused him of harboring dictatorial ambitions, comparing his third-term bid to the very authoritarian leaders America might soon be fighting overseas. Roosevelt's supporters countered that extraordinary global circumstances justified extraordinary flexibility, and that voters, not tradition, should ultimately decide how many terms any president deserved to serve. No law technically prevented Roosevelt from running again, since the two-term limit existed purely as custom, rather than legal requirement until the 22nd Amendment formalized it years later. Roosevelt won decisively, proving that voters largely trusted his leadership during uncertain times more than they valued preserving an informal tradition. The controversy nevertheless left lasting unease about executive power that would eventually prompt Congress to codify term limits permanently after his presidency ended. And speaking of campaign songs designed to mock political opponents rather than celebrate candidates, the 1940 Martin, Barton, and Fish tune became an unexpectedly catchy piece of political theater. Roosevelt's supporters wanted to paint congressional Republicans as obstructionist isolationists who'd resisted preparing America for potential involvement in the growing World War. Democratic strategists settled on three Republican congressmen, Joseph Martin, Bruce Barton, and Hamilton Fish, whose names happened to fit together with an irresistible rhythmic cadence. Roosevelt himself began repeating the phrase during campaign speeches, drawing out the names with theatrical emphasis until crowds started chanting it back rhythmically like a genuine song. The tactic proved remarkably effective at reducing complex foreign policy disagreements into a memorable, almost musical soundbite that stuck in voters' minds far longer than detailed policy arguments ever could. Republicans understandably found the mockery frustrating, arguing that legitimate concerns about military spending and international entanglement deserved serious debate rather than playground-style rhyming taunts. The episode demonstrated how effective simple repetition and rhythm could be in political messaging, a lesson campaign strategists would continue applying long after the specific congressmen involved were largely forgotten by history. Sometimes elections aren't won through policy papers, but through phrases catchy enough that voters can't stop humming them. And speaking of jokes that seemed harmless in the moment but drew unexpected criticism afterward, the 1944 Dewey mustache joke revealed how even wartime campaigns couldn't entirely escape pettiness. Thomas Dewey, the Republican nominee challenging Roosevelt for an unprecedented fourth term, sported a neatly trimmed mustache that became an oddly persistent talking point throughout the campaign season. Roosevelt reportedly made offhand jokes referencing Dewey's appearance, comments that circulated among political insiders and eventually reached wider audiences through newspaper coverage and gossip. Critics argued that mocking a candidate's physical appearance felt beneath the dignity of a wartime presidential campaign, especially when American soldiers were fighting and dying overseas during the same period. Roosevelt's defenders suggested the comments were lighthearted rather than genuinely mean-spirited, reflecting the kind of casual humor common in private political conversations that occasionally leaked into public view. Dewey himself largely avoided directly addressing the mustache commentary, focusing instead on substantive criticisms of New Deal programs and Roosevelt's handling of domestic wartime policy. The episode remained a relatively minor footnote compared to the serious issues dominating that election, yet it demonstrated how personal appearance and petty humor could still creep into even the most consequential campaigns imaginable. Roosevelt won his fourth term regardless, though he wouldn't live to complete it. And speaking of confident predictions that aged terribly within just a few hours, the 1948 Dewey defeats Truman headline became perhaps the most famous wrong prediction in American newspaper history. The Chicago Tribune, facing an early printing deadline and confident based on pre-election polling, ran the bold headline announcing Dewey's victory before final election returns had actually been counted or confirmed. Truman, trailing badly in nearly every published poll leading up to Election Day, ended up winning a stunning upset that shocked political analysts and pollsters across the country. A now iconic photograph captured Truman grinning triumphantly while holding up the erroneous newspaper, turning the Tribune's embarrassing mistake into a permanent symbol of his unlikely comeback victory. The error stemmed partly from a printer's strike that forced earlier deadlines, combined with overconfident reliance on polling methods that hadn't yet accounted for late shifting voter sentiment. The incident became a lasting cautionary tale about the dangers of premature political predictions, reminding journalists and pollsters alike that elections aren't truly decided until every vote gets counted. Decades later, That single photograph remains one of the most recognizable images in American political history, still referenced whenever confident predictions collapse spectacularly on election night. And speaking of unconventional campaign strategies born from desperation and low approval ratings, Truman's whistle-stop tour transformed what looked like a doomed re-election bid into one of history's great political comebacks. Traveling by train across thousands of miles, Truman delivered hundreds of short, direct speeches from the rear platform at countless small towns and rural stops most national campaigns typically ignored entirely. His folksy, combative style resonated with everyday voters who appreciated his willingness to speak plainly rather than relying on polished rhetoric crafted by professional speechwriters. Truman repeatedly attacked what he called the Do-Nothing Congress, framing himself as a fighter for ordinary working Americans against entrenched political interests in Washington. Crowds grew progressively larger and more enthusiastic as the tour continued, though national pollsters largely dismissed this grassroots energy as unrepresentative of broader public sentiment. The relentless pace demonstrated remarkable physical endurance, with Truman sometimes delivering over a dozen speeches daily across multiple states during a single exhausting stretch. His stubborn refusal to accept seemingly inevitable defeat ultimately paid off spectacularly, proving that direct personal connection with voters could still overcome unfavorable polling numbers and skeptical media coverage. And speaking of party unity collapsing over deeply contentious social issues, the 1948 Dixiecrat Challenge exposed painful divisions within the Democratic coalition that had held together since Roosevelt's era. When the Democratic National Convention adopted a stronger civil rights platform than many Southern delegates could accept, Strom Thurmond led a walkout that eventually formed the state's rights Democratic Party, commonly nicknamed the Dixiecrats. Thurmond's third-party campaign focused primarily on preserving racial segregation and opposing federal civil rights legislation that Northern Democrats increasingly supported. The Dixiecrats ultimately won 4 Southern states outright, demonstrating genuine regional support for their platform, while simultaneously threatening to fracture Democratic dominance across the traditionally reliable South. Many political observers worried the split might hand victory to Dewey by dividing Democratic votes across competing candidates. Truman nevertheless managed to win re-election despite losing those Southern states, proving his coalition could survive without unanimous Southern support for the first time in generations. The Dixiecrat Rebellion foreshadowed deeper realignments that would reshape American politics over subsequent decades, as regional loyalties gradually shifted according to evolving positions on civil rights. What began as a single election dispute ultimately signaled the slow unraveling of the political arrangements that had defined American party politics since the Great Depression. And speaking of political comebacks built on unconventional media strategy, the 1952 Checkers speech showed how television could rescue a career that seemed finished. Richard Nixon, Eisenhower's running mate, faced allegations that he'd used a secret political fund for personal expenses, a scandal serious enough that many advisors urged Eisenhower to drop him from the ticket entirely. Instead, Nixon went on national television and defended himself directly to the American public, addressing the fund allegations point by point with financial disclosures most politicians would never have dared to share. Near the end, he mentioned that his family had received one gift he refused to return, a small cocker spaniel his daughters named Checkers, and he wasn't giving the dog back no matter what critics said. The speech was emotional, personal, and unlike anything American audiences had seen from a national politician before. Telegrams and letters flooded in overwhelmingly supportive, essentially forcing Eisenhower to keep Nixon on the ticket regardless of his own reservations. Critics called it manipulative theater, designed to distract from legitimate financial questions. Supporters called it an authentic, relatable defense from a man willing to be vulnerable in public. Either way, the Checkers speech proved that television could save a political career overnight, a lesson every campaign strategist would remember for decades afterward. And speaking of that same election cycle embracing television in entirely new ways, Eisenhower's campaign advertisements marked the true beginning of modern political marketing on the small screen. Rather than relying solely on speeches, rallies, and newspaper endorsements, Eisenhower's team produced short, punchy television spots designed to reach voters directly in their living rooms. These ads, often just a minute long, featured simple slogans and friendly imagery, treating Eisenhower less like a distant general and more like an approachable, trustworthy leader. Advertising professionals, some borrowed directly from commercial marketing firms, helped craft messaging that emphasized emotion and simplicity over lengthy policy explanations. Critics worried this reduced serious presidential politics to something resembling a soap commercial, selling candidates the same way companies sold soap or cigarettes. Supporters argued television simply reflected how Americans were already consuming information, and campaigns needed to adapt or risk irrelevance. Regardless of which side was right, the strategy worked remarkably well, helping Eisenhower connect with millions of voters who might never attend a rally or read a lengthy policy pamphlet. Every campaign that followed would study these early spots closely, refining the same basic formula for generations. Political advertising as we now know it essentially began right here. And speaking of television transforming elections into something entirely new, the 1960 Kennedy-Nixon debates became a landmark moment that changed campaign media forever. For the first time, presidential candidates faced each other on live television, allowing millions of Americans to watch them respond directly to questions and to each other in real time. Kennedy appeared calm, tanned, and comfortable under the studio lights, while Nixon, still recovering from illness and famously refusing makeup, looked pale and visibly uneasy by comparison. Interestingly, radio listeners who only heard the debate's audio often felt Nixon had performed just as well or better on substance, while television viewers overwhelmingly favored Kennedy's appearance and composure. This split reaction became a defining case study in how visual presentation could shape political perception, independent of actual policy arguments. Subsequent debates that year focused more on substantive issues, though the first debate's visual impact remained the most discussed and remembered moment of the entire series. Kennedy's narrow victory that November led many analysts to credit television exposure as a decisive factor, whether or not that assessment was entirely accurate. From that point forward, presidential campaigns would treat televised debates as essential events, permanently changing how candidates prepared and presented themselves to voters. And speaking of that same extraordinarily close election raising lingering questions about fairness, the 1960 Daily Machine allegations in Illinois became one of the most debated controversies in modern election history. Kennedy won Illinois by an extremely narrow margin, with Chicago's results heavily influenced by Mayor Richard Daley's powerful political machine, playing a crucial role in delivering the state's electoral votes. Republicans alleged widespread irregularities, including reports of votes cast by deceased individuals and suspiciously high turnout in certain precincts loyal to the Democratic machine. Nixon reportedly considered contesting the results but ultimately declined, citing concerns about national stability during the escalating Cold War and a desire to avoid prolonged political turmoil. Investigations into the allegations produced mixed and inconclusive findings, with historians still disagreeing today about whether any fraud actually changed the outcome, or whether normal political machine tactics were simply exaggerated by frustrated opponents. What remains certain is that the controversy fueled lasting skepticism about urban political machines and their influence over close national elections. The episode also demonstrated remarkable restraint from Nixon, who chose national unity over a potentially destabilizing legal battle. Decades later, this remains one of the most cited examples whenever elections are decided by exceptionally narrow margins. And speaking of religious identity becoming an unexpected campaign issue, the 1960 Catholic question forced John Kennedy to directly confront widespread concerns about his faith influencing presidential decisions. Many voters, particularly in heavily Protestant regions, worried that a Catholic president might feel obligated to follow directives from the Vatican rather than upholding constitutional separation between church and state. Kennedy addressed these fears head-on in a widely covered speech to Protestant ministers in Houston, firmly stating his belief in an America where religious affiliation would never determine loyalty to the Constitution. He emphasized that no Catholic official would allow religious authorities to dictate public policy, and that he would resign rather than violate his conscience or the nation's founding principles. The speech was widely praised for its clarity and conviction, helping ease anxieties among voters who remained genuinely uncertain rather than hostile. Critics on both sides existed, some feeling Kennedy conceded too much ground by even addressing the topic, others believing more discussion was warranted. Kennedy's eventual victory made him the first Catholic president in American history, a milestone many considered evidence that religious barriers in national politics could gradually soften with careful, direct communication. And speaking of televised advertisements that generated far more discussion than their limited airtime ever suggested, the Daisy advertisement from Johnson's 1964 campaign became one of the most famous political ads ever produced, despite airing publicly just once. The commercial opened with a young girl innocently counting daisy petals in a sunny field, before transitioning abruptly into ominous countdown imagery culminating in a devastating nuclear explosion. The unmistakable implication suggested that Johnson's opponent, Barry Goldwater, known for hawkish rhetoric regarding nuclear weapons, might recklessly risk catastrophic global conflict if elected president. Goldwater's campaign strongly objected, arguing the ad unfairly distorted his actual policy positions into something resembling reckless warmongering. The controversy generated enormous free media coverage, with news programs replaying and discussing the ad extensively long after its single paid broadcast had ended. This unintentional amplification proved remarkably effective, ensuring millions more people saw the commercial through news coverage than would have through the original advertising buy alone. The Daisy ad remains a textbook example studied in political communication courses, demonstrating how powerful emotional imagery could shape public perception far beyond its actual airtime, sometimes needing just one broadcast to leave a lasting impression on an entire election. 61. And speaking of catchy campaign slogans that backfired spectacularly, Barry Goldwater's 1964 team came up with, "In your heart you know he's right." It was meant to convey conviction and moral clarity, a candidate who wouldn't waver on his principles no matter how controversial they seemed. The problem was that slogans this earnest tend to invite mockery, and Democrats seized the opportunity almost immediately. The rebuttal, "In your heart you know he might," started circulating widely, turning Goldwater's sincerity into a punchline. Some accounts suggest an even sharper version existed, playing on fears about his hawkish reputation, though exact origins remain debated among historians of the campaign. Either way, the counter slogan spread through newspapers, buttons, and casual conversation far more effectively than the original ever could have hoped. It became a case study in how easily political messaging can be flipped against its creator, with just a few clever words. Goldwater's team never quite recovered the narrative advantage after that. The episode remains a gentle reminder that confidence in a slogan doesn't guarantee the public will read it the way campaign strategists intended. Sometimes the opposition writes your ad for you, and sometimes that ad becomes the one people actually remember decades later. 62. And speaking of slogans that captured an entire national mood, Richard Nixon's 1968 campaign built itself around the theme of law and order. The country was reeling from urban unrest, high-profile assassinations, and widespread anxiety about crime and social upheaval, and Nixon positioned himself as the candidate who could restore stability. The phrase appeared constantly in speeches, television spots, and campaign literature, appealing to voters who felt genuinely unsettled by the turbulence of the era. Critics argued the messaging carried coded implications about race and social control, while supporters insisted it simply reflected legitimate concerns about rising crime rates and civil disorder. Both interpretations coexisted throughout the campaign, and historians continue to debate how deliberately the phrase was crafted versus how organically it emerged from the political climate. What's clear is that it resonated powerfully with an electorate exhausted by constant unrest, helping Nixon distinguish himself from an administration seen as struggling to contain the chaos. The theme proved durable, following Nixon into his presidency and shaping policy priorities for years afterward. Few campaign phrases have been studied as extensively for their layered meaning, and few captured a specific national mood as precisely as those three simple words did in 1968. 63. And speaking of third-party strategies designed to reshape the entire electoral map, George Wallace's 1968 campaign pursued a genuinely unusual goal. Rather than trying to win outright, Wallace aimed to capture enough electoral votes, primarily across the South, to deny both major party candidates a majority in the Electoral College. If he succeeded, the decision would move to the House of Representatives, where Wallace hoped to leverage his block of votes for concessions on policy or influence. It was an audacious strategy, treating the Electoral College's mechanics as a tool rather than an obstacle. Wallace ultimately won 5 states and 46 electoral votes, a significant showing for a third-party candidate, though ultimately not enough to force the contingency scenario he'd hoped for. Nixon secured a majority on his own, closing the door on Wallace's plan. Still, the strategy demonstrated genuine vulnerabilities in the Electoral College system, vulnerabilities that political scientists continue studying whenever third-party candidates gain traction. Wallace's approach remains a fascinating example of a campaign built not around winning, but around leverage, a reminder that presidential elections sometimes involve strategies far more complicated than simply earning the most votes nationwide. 64. And speaking of controversies that historians still can't fully agree on, the 1968 Vietnam peace talks controversy involves questions that remain genuinely murky even decades later. As the Johnson administration pushed for peace negotiations before the election, allegations later surfaced that individuals connected to Nixon's campaign may have encouraged South Vietnamese officials to delay participating in talks, hoping a stalled peace process would benefit Nixon politically. Some historians point to notes and phone records suggesting these contacts happened with at least some awareness at senior campaign levels. Others argue the evidence remains circumstantial, open to interpretation, and insufficient to draw firm conclusions about coordinated interference. Johnson himself reportedly suspected something was happening but chose not to make his suspicions public before the election, uncertain how voters would react to unverified claims. The peace talks ultimately stalled regardless of the underlying causes, and the war continued for years afterward. This remains one of those historical episodes where documents exist, memories conflict, and definitive answers stay frustratingly out of reach. Researchers continue combing through archives hoping for clarity, but for now the full truth of what happened behind the scenes in 1968 remains genuinely contested among serious historians. 65. And speaking of forged documents that derailed a presidential campaign almost overnight, the Canuck letter caused serious damage to Senator Edmund Muskie right before the crucial 1972 New Hampshire primary. A letter published in a prominent New Hampshire newspaper claimed Muskie had personally mocked French Canadian Americans, a politically damaging accusation in a state with a substantial French Canadian population. Muskie, visibly emotional while responding to the allegations publicly, appeared to some observers as unstable under pressure, an image that stuck regardless of the letter's actual authenticity. It later emerged that the letter had been fabricated, part of a broader pattern of political sabotage during that election cycle. The damage, however, had already been done. Muskie's campaign, once considered a strong frontrunner, began losing momentum almost immediately afterward. Investigations eventually connected the forged letter to a wider effort involving dirty tricks aimed at undermining Democratic candidates before the general election. The episode became one of the clearest examples of how a single fabricated document, released at precisely the right moment, could meaningfully alter a presidential race. Muskie's campaign never fully recovered, and historians still cite this letter as a pivotal moment in the shifting fortunes of that year's Democratic primary contest. 66. And speaking of small break-ins that eventually revealed something far larger, the Watergate burglary in June 1972 began almost quietly. 5 men caught inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters, arrested for attempting to plant surveillance equipment and photograph documents. At first, it seemed like a minor story, barely registering in the middle of a presidential campaign focused on much bigger headlines. Investigative reporting gradually uncovered connections between the burglars and individuals tied to Nixon's re-election campaign, revealing a broader pattern of political espionage far beyond a single break-in. As journalists and investigators pulled threads, evidence emerged suggesting efforts to conceal these connections, involving senior administration officials attempting to manage the fallout. What began as a strange, almost forgettable news item slowly transformed into one of the defining political scandals in American history. The unfolding investigation eventually reached the highest levels of government, raising fundamental questions about accountability, power, and the limits of executive authority. Congressional hearings, court proceedings, and continued reporting kept the story developing for nearly 2 years afterward. Watergate remains a case study in how seemingly small incidents can unravel into something far more consequential once persisting questions refuse to go away. 67. And speaking of political labels designed to make an opponent sound dangerously out of step, Republicans in 1972 leaned heavily on what became known as McGovernization, using George McGovern's name almost as a verb to describe positions they wanted to paint as radical or outside mainstream American values. The strategy involved tying any Democratic candidate or policy idea to McGovern's more progressive stances on the war, defense spending, and social programs, regardless of how closely those positions actually matched. McGovern's landslide loss that November only reinforced the label's staying power, and for years afterward, Democratic strategists worried about candidates being McGovernized by association. The tactic reflected a broader pattern in campaign messaging, where a single candidate's name becomes shorthand for an entire ideological category, useful for opponents, exhausting for anyone trying to have a nuanced policy conversation. Historians note that McGovern's actual platform was more complicated than the caricature suggested, but caricatures tend to travel faster than nuance ever does. The label lingered in political vocabulary long after the campaign ended, occasionally resurfacing whenever pundits wanted a quick way to suggest a candidate had drifted too far from the electoral center. Few campaigns have had their name turned into quite so durable a piece of political shorthand. 68. And speaking of debate moments that took on a life far beyond the original exchange, Gerald Ford's 1976 debate against Jimmy Carter produced one of the most scrutinized single sentences in televised debate history. Discussing Eastern Europe, Ford stated there was no Soviet domination of the region, a claim that immediately puzzled moderators and viewers alike, given the well-documented realities of Soviet influence at the time. Ford seemed to intend a more nuanced point about the spirit and resilience of Eastern European nations, but the phrasing landed as a factual misstep, and the moment dominated post-debate coverage for days. Reporters pressed him for clarification, and rather than quickly correcting the statement, Ford's team took time to address it, allowing the story to grow larger than perhaps it needed to. Some historians argue the gaffe meaningfully damaged Ford's momentum in an already tight race, while others suggest its impact gets overstated in retrospect, one moment among many factors shaping that year's outcome. Either way, the line became a textbook example of how a single awkward sentence in a nationally televised debate can overshadow substantive policy discussion entirely. Decades later, it's still cited in media training seminars as a cautionary tale about precision under pressure. 69. And speaking of interviews that generated far more controversy than campaigns typically anticipate, Jimmy Carter's 1976 conversation with Playboy magazine became an unexpected flashpoint in that year's election. Carter, a devout Southern Baptist running as a candidate of personal integrity, agreed to the interview hoping to reach younger and more secular voters who might otherwise view him as overly conservative. The conversation touched on genuine policy substance, but it was Carter's candid remarks about having looked on other women with lust in his heart, and his broader reflections on private morality that dominated headlines afterward. Religious voters expressed discomfort with the venue itself, while others found his honesty refreshing in an era still adjusting to Watergate-induced cynicism about political sincerity. Carter's campaign scrambled to manage the fallout, emphasizing that the remarks reflected humility rather than scandal. The episode remains a fascinating study in how context can complicate even well-intentioned candor, a magazine associated with one image colliding with a candidate cultivating an entirely different one. Carter went on to win the election regardless, suggesting the controversy, while intense in the moment, ultimately proved less consequential than commentators at the time predicted it might become. 70. And speaking of simple debate questions that reshaped how campaigns talk about the economy, Ronald Reagan's 1980 debate against Jimmy Carter included a line that became one of the most quoted moments in modern political history. Reagan asked voters directly whether they were better off than they had been 4 years earlier. A deceptively simple question that reframed the entire election around personal economic experience rather than abstract policy debate. The phrase resonated immediately with an electorate frustrated by inflation, unemployment, and the broader economic anxieties of the late 1970s. Carter's campaign struggled to counter the question effectively, since it invited voters to answer based on lived experience rather than statistics or policy explanations. Political strategists took note, and variations of Reagan's question have appeared in nearly every presidential campaign since, regardless of party. Historians consider it a masterclass in distilling complex economic conditions into language ordinary voters could immediately apply to their own lives. The question's simplicity was precisely its power, requiring no elaborate rebuttal because it invited each listener to answer for themselves. Few single lines from any debate have shaped subsequent campaign messaging quite as thoroughly as that one did. 71. And speaking of disputed claims that continued generating historical debate decades later, Allegations surrounding the timing of the 1980 Iran hostage crisis remain genuinely unresolved among researchers. Some individuals connected to Reagan's campaign were accused of secretly negotiating with Iranian officials to delay the release of American hostages until after the election, hoping to deny Carter a potential October surprise that might have boosted his re-election chances. Proponents of this theory point to testimony from certain individuals claiming direct knowledge of such contacts, while skeptics note the evidence relies heavily on secondhand accounts and lacks definitive documentation. Congressional investigations examined the claims in the early 1990s and found insufficient evidence to conclusively prove coordinated interference, though they didn't entirely rule out the possibility either. The hostages were released within minutes of Reagan's inauguration, a timing coincidence that has fueled speculation for over 4 decades regardless of what investigators officially concluded. Historians studying the episode generally urge caution, noting how easily compelling narratives can outpace verifiable fact in cases involving classified diplomacy and conflicting testimony. The full truth, if it exists in recoverable form, remains elusive, another reminder that some historical questions may simply never receive fully satisfying answers. 72. And speaking of campaign advertising that succeeded through optimism rather than confrontation, Reagan's 1984 re-election campaign produced what became one of the most fondly remembered political commercials in American history. Known as Morning in America, the ad featured warm, ordinary scenes, families moving into new homes, couples getting married, flags being raised, all set against gentle narration, describing national renewal and confidence. Rather than attacking his opponent directly, Reagan's team chose to project reassurance, suggesting the country had recovered from the economic troubles of the previous decade and was moving toward brighter days. The approach proved remarkably effective, reinforcing Reagan's personal popularity while avoiding the harsher tone often associated with campaign advertising. Media analysts frequently cite the commercial as a turning point in political messaging, demonstrating that emotional optimism could be just as persuasive, if not more so, than pointed criticism. The ad's soft visual style and calming tone became a template that countless campaigns have attempted to replicate ever since, rarely with quite the same success. Reagan went on to win re-election by an overwhelming margin, and Morning in America remains a case study in the enduring power of hopeful, unifying imagery over division. 73. And speaking of debate moments where humor became the ultimate rebuttal, Ronald Reagan's second debate against Walter Mondale in 1984 produced one of the most famous lines in campaign history. At 73, Reagan faced persistent questions about whether his age might affect his capacity to serve a second term, especially after a shaky performance in the first debate raised genuine concern among voters and even some supporters. When a moderator directly asked about it, Reagan responded that he would not make age an issue of the campaign, and that he was not going to exploit for political purposes his opponent's youth and inexperience. The room erupted in laughter, and even Mondale himself couldn't help smiling. The line effectively ended the age narrative overnight, transforming a potential vulnerability into a moment of charm and confidence. Mondale later admitted he knew in that instant the debate, and arguably the race, had shifted. Political strategists still study the exchange as a model for turning a liability into an asset through timing and self-deprecating wit. Sometimes the most effective political weapon isn't a devastating attack, but a perfectly delivered joke that makes the audience forget what they were worried about in the first place. 74. And speaking of advertisements that generated far more controversy than the campaigns that benefited from them may have anticipated, the Willie Horton ad of 1988 became one of the most debated pieces of political messaging in modern history. The advertisement highlighted the case of Willie Horton, a convicted felon who committed additional crimes while on a weekend furlough from a Massachusetts prison during Michael Dukakis's tenure as governor. Technically produced by an independent political action committee rather than the Bush campaign itself, the ad used Horton's case to raise questions about Dukakis's approach to criminal justice policy. Critics argued the advertisement relied on racially charged imagery and fear-based messaging that oversimplified a complex policy issue into a single frightening narrative. Defenders maintained it legitimately highlighted a genuine flaw in furlough policy that voters deserved to know about. The controversy sparked lasting debate about the boundaries between legitimate policy criticism and manipulation of public emotion, along with broader questions about how independent groups can shape campaigns without direct candidate accountability. Decades later, communications scholars still cite the ad in discussions about how single images and narratives can define a campaign narrative far beyond their factual proportions, a reminder of how powerful and controversial fear-based messaging can become in a close national election. 75. And speaking of images that outlived their original intent, Michael Dukakis's 1988 ride in a military tank became one of the most enduring visual missteps in American campaign history. Intended to demonstrate his support for a strong national defense and counter perceptions that he was weak on military issues, the photo opportunity instead produced footage many viewers found awkward, showing Dukakis wearing an oversized helmet while smiling from inside the vehicle. Rather than projecting strength, the imagery struck many as unintentionally comedic, and the Bush campaign quickly incorporated the footage into advertisements mocking Dukakis's attempt at a tough, military-friendly image. The moment became a cautionary tale within political consulting circles about the unpredictable nature of visual messaging, where a single photograph can undermine weeks of careful policy positioning. Historians studying the episode note that Dukakis's underlying defense positions were more substantive than the image suggested, but by then the narrative had already taken hold in public memory. The tank ride is now frequently referenced in media training as an example of why campaigns rehearse even seemingly simple visual opportunities extensively. Few single images from any campaign have been replayed and parodied quite as persistently, proving that in modern politics, perception often outpaces policy substance in shaping lasting public memory. 76. And speaking of pledges that seemed politically wise in the moment, but carried heavier consequences later, George H. W. Bush's 1988 promise during his nomination acceptance speech became one of the most quoted lines in campaign history. Declaring, "Read my lips, no new taxes," Bush aimed to reassure conservative voters wary of tax increases while distinguishing himself from Democratic proposals. The pledge helped solidify support during the campaign, resonating with an electorate still sensitive to economic pressures from the previous decade. However, once in office, Bush faced a growing budget deficit and mounting pressure from Congress, ultimately agreeing to a bipartisan budget deal that included tax increases in 1990. Critics seized on the reversal immediately, and the phrase became a symbol of broken political promises for years afterward. Defenders argued Bush made a difficult but necessary decision for the nation's fiscal health, prioritizing governance over political convenience. The controversy contributed to diminished trust among some conservative voters during his 1992 re-election campaign. Political analysts still cite the episode as a cautionary example of how a memorable campaign promise can become a lasting liability when circumstances require difficult compromises, illustrating the tension between campaign rhetoric and the practical realities of governing a complex nation. 77. And speaking of campaign strategies built around speed and message discipline, Bill Clinton's 1992 campaign introduced what became known as the War Room, a rapid response operation designed to counter attacks and control the day's news narrative almost in real time. Led by strategists including James Carville, the War Room monitored opposition statements and media coverage continuously, crafting quick rebuttals before negative stories could gain lasting traction. The team famously kept a sign reading, "It's the economy, stupid," as a constant reminder to stay focused on the issue voters cared about most rather than getting pulled into unrelated controversies. This disciplined approach to messaging was considered innovative at the time, reflecting a more aggressive and immediate style of political communication than previous campaigns had typically employed. Journalists praised the operation's efficiency, while some critics worried it prioritized rapid spin over substantive policy discussion. Regardless of perspective, the War Room model influenced nearly every major campaign that followed, establishing rapid response as a standard component of modern political strategy. Clinton's victory that November reinforced the perceived effectiveness of the approach, cementing its place in campaign history as a turning point in how candidates manage narrative control during an increasingly fast-paced media environment. 78. And speaking of unpredictable twists that added extraordinary volatility to an already unusual race, Ross Perot's brief withdrawal from the 1992 presidential campaign remains one of the more curious episodes in modern electoral history. Running as an independent candidate with substantial early polling support, Perot abruptly dropped out in July, citing concerns about disruptions to the election process before unexpectedly re-entering the race in October. His absence and subsequent return left many supporters confused about his intentions, and some questioned whether the decision reflected strategic recalibration or genuine uncertainty about the demands of a national campaign. Despite the disruption, Perot went on to receive a notable share of the popular vote, demonstrating that a significant portion of the electorate remained interested in an alternative to the two major parties. Analysts continue to debate what impact, if any, his campaign had on the ultimate outcome between Bush and Clinton. The episode remains a fascinating case study in third-party politics, illustrating both the appeal and the challenges facing independent candidates operating outside traditional party structures. Perot's unconventional campaign style, combining folksy charts with blunt economic warnings, left a lasting impression on American political culture regardless of the final electoral results. 79. And speaking of phrases that became shorthand for an entire campaign philosophy, James Carville's internal reminder to Bill Clinton's 1992 staff, "It's the economy, stupid," evolved into the most quoted slogan associated with that election cycle. Originally posted on a whiteboard inside the war room as a simple discipline tool, meant to keep staffers focused on economic messaging, rather than getting distracted by unrelated controversies, the phrase leaked into public conversation and took on a life of its own. Reporters loved its bluntness. Voters found it relatable during a period of economic anxiety following a recession, and rival campaigns struggled to counter its simplicity. Carville never intended it as a public slogan, yet it became inseparable from Clinton's identity as a candidate who understood everyday financial concerns better than his opponent. The phrase has since become a permanent fixture in American political vocabulary, invoked by strategists and commentators across every subsequent election to argue that economic conditions ultimately decide presidential outcomes more than any other single factor. Political scientists still debate how much credit the phrase deserves versus the underlying economic reality it described, but few campaign reminders have ever escaped the war room and entered permanent cultural memory quite so completely. 80. And speaking of advertisements that shaped public opinion without ever mentioning a single candidate by name, the Harry and Louise commercials of 1993 and 1994 became remarkably influential in the debate over healthcare reform during Clinton's presidency. Funded by the Health Insurance Association of America, the ads featured a fictional middle-class couple sitting at their kitchen table, worriedly discussing the complexity and potential downsides of the proposed reform plan. The commercials never attacked Clinton directly, instead relying on relatable characters expressing quiet, reasonable-sounding concerns about choice and government involvement in healthcare decisions. Critics argued the ads oversimplified a complicated policy proposal and exaggerated certain provisions to stoke anxiety among viewers. Supporters countered that the ads simply translated dense legislative language into concerns ordinary families could understand and relate to. Regardless of interpretation, the campaign proved remarkably effective, contributing to a shift in public opinion that helped derail the broader reform effort in Congress. Communications scholars frequently cite Harry and Louise as an early example of how issue advertising, rather than candidate advertising, can shape the fate of major legislation, demonstrating that influencing policy debates doesn't always require mentioning a politician's name at all. 81. And speaking of small physical moments that television transformed into lasting campaign narratives, Bob Dole's accidental fall from a stage platform during a 1996 campaign stop became an unexpectedly memorable visual moment of that race. While reaching to shake hands with supporters, a railing gave way beneath him, sending him briefly tumbling before aides helped him back up, uninjured and characteristically good-humored about the incident afterward. News networks replayed the footage repeatedly throughout the following days, and though Dole handled the moment with self-deprecating grace, some commentators couldn't resist connecting it to ongoing questions about his age and stamina compared to the incumbent President Clinton. Dole's campaign insisted the moment reflected nothing more than an unfortunate accident involving faulty equipment, and many voters agreed it was simply an unlucky slip rather than any meaningful indicator of his fitness for office. Still, the widespread replay of the clip illustrated how television could amplify even minor physical mishaps into recurring talking points during a campaign. Media analysts have since referenced the episode when discussing how visual moments, regardless of their actual significance, can dominate news cycles and shape public perception far more than substantive policy discussions ever could during a fast-moving election season. 82. And speaking of design choices with consequences nobody fully anticipated, the butterfly ballot used in Palm Beach County during the 2000 presidential election became one of the most scrutinized pieces of paper in American electoral history. Intended to make candidate names larger and easier to read for the county's substantial elderly population, the layout instead placed punch holes in a confusing alignment that led some voters to accidentally select Reform Party candidate Pat Buchanan when they intended to vote for Democratic candidate Al Gore, given the razor-thin margin separating Gore and George W. Bush in Florida. Even a small number of miscast votes carried enormous significance in a state that would ultimately decide the entire presidency. Election officials defended the ballot design as a good-faith attempt at clarity, while frustrated voters and statisticians pointed to unusual voting patterns in the county as evidence of genuine confusion, rather than a shift in political sentiment. The controversy became a central symbol of the broader chaos surrounding Florida's vote count, illustrating how something as mundane as ballot formatting could carry monumental consequences. Election design experts still study the butterfly ballot today as a foundational case study in how visual clarity, or the lack of it, can directly influence democratic outcomes. 83. And speaking of moments where organized protest intersected directly with an active vote count, the so-called Brooks Brothers riot in Miami-Dade County became a notable flashpoint during the tense weeks following the 2000 election. As election officials attempted to conduct a manual recount of disputed ballots, a group of Republican operatives and activists, many dressed in business attire, gathered outside the counting room and staged a vocal, physically assertive protest against the process continuing. Demonstrators pounded on doors, shouted accusations of unfairness, and created an atmosphere officials later described as intimidating and chaotic. Shortly afterward, Miami-Dade canvassing board members voted to halt the manual recount altogether, citing time constraints and the disruptive environment as contributing factors in their decision. Critics argued the protest constituted an orchestrated effort to influence the outcome of a legitimate government process, while defenders framed it as a passionate but ultimately lawful expression of frustration over what many viewed as an already contentious and drawn-out vote-counting effort. The episode remains a frequently cited example in discussions about the boundaries between civic protests and undue pressure on electoral officials, illustrating how public demonstrations can directly intersect with and potentially influence the machinery of democracy during moments of extraordinary national tension. 84. And speaking of decisions that brought one of the closest elections in American history to its final conclusion, the Supreme Court's ruling in Bush versus Gore effectively ended Florida's contentious recount process in December of 2000. After weeks of legal battles over manual recounts, ballot standards, and deadlines, the case reached the nation's highest court, which ruled that the inconsistent recount procedures being used across different counties violated equal protection principles under the Constitution. With no clear alternative method available before certification deadlines, the court's decision effectively halted further recounting, leaving Bush ahead by a narrow margin of just a few hundred votes statewide. The ruling awarded Florida's electoral votes, and with them the presidency, to George W. Bush, ending one of the most closely contested elections in the nation's history. Supporters of the decision argued the court appropriately resolved an unworkable legal and logistical crisis before the country's electoral deadlines. Critics contended the ruling effectively decided an election through judicial intervention, rather than allowing the full democratic process to conclude naturally. Legal scholars continued debating the decision's reasoning and precedent decades later, and the case remains a defining example of how constitutional interpretation, timing, and procedure can ultimately determine the outcome of a presidential election. 85. And speaking of campaign advertisements that resurrected decades-old military service records as a modern political weapon, the Swiftboat Veterans for Truth ads in 2004 became one of the most consequential and controversial advertising campaigns in recent presidential history. A group of Vietnam veterans, some of whom had served alongside Democratic nominee John Kerry, publicly challenged his account of combat experiences and the medals he received during his service. Kerry's supporters and many independent journalists disputed the accuracy of the claims, pointing to official military records that seemed to contradict the group's version of events. The ads received relatively limited television airtime yet dominated news coverage and talk radio for weeks, illustrating how earned media coverage could amplify an advertisement far beyond its actual paid distribution. Kerry's campaign was criticized afterward for responding too slowly, allowing the narrative to solidify before offering a forceful rebuttal. The controversy introduced a new term into political vocabulary entirely: swift boating, used ever since to describe coordinated efforts to attack a candidate's personal record rather than their policy positions. Historians still debate how much the ads actually influenced the final result, but few campaigns since have ignored the lesson about responding quickly to character-based attacks. 86. And speaking of election administration problems that echoed the chaos of 2000 in an entirely different state, the 2004 presidential election in Ohio produced its own set of voting irregularity concerns that fueled lasting distrust in the process. Voters in some precincts, particularly in urban and heavily Democratic areas, waited in lines stretching several hours, attributed by officials to insufficient voting machines and long ballots covering numerous local issues. Critics argued the shortages disproportionately affected certain communities, while election officials maintained the problem stemmed from budget constraints and underestimated turnout rather than any deliberate strategy. Concerns also emerged regarding electronic voting machines, with some analysts questioning whether the systems used by various counties provided adequate security and verifiable paper trails. Ohio's electoral votes ultimately proved decisive in securing President Bush's re-election, which meant the state's administrative shortcomings received intense national scrutiny in the following month. Congressional Democrats raised formal objections during the certification of electoral votes, a rare occurrence in modern presidential elections. Reforms following the election focused on updating machines and expanding polling locations, though debates over voting access and election administration in Ohio and elsewhere have continued in every election cycle since. 87. And speaking of campaign culture finding entirely new digital forms of expression, the Yes We Can video released during the 2008 primary season demonstrated how quickly online media could reshape political enthusiasm. Musician will.i.am produced the piece after being inspired by a Barack Obama speech, recruiting numerous celebrities and musicians to lend their voices to a melodic tribute built entirely around the candidate's own words. The video spread rapidly online, accumulating millions of views without any direct funding or coordination from the Obama campaign itself, illustrating the emerging power of grassroots digital content operating independently from official campaign channels. Supporters praised it as an authentic expression of cultural enthusiasm, while some critics questioned whether celebrity-driven content blurred the line between organic support and orchestrated promotion. Regardless of interpretation, the video became a landmark moment demonstrating how internet platforms could generate campaign momentum in ways television advertising simply couldn't replicate. Communications scholars frequently cite it as an early example of viral political content, a phenomenon that would only grow more central to every subsequent presidential campaign, as social media platforms expanded and campaign strategy adapted accordingly. 88. And speaking of ordinary phrases that briefly consumed an entire news cycle, Barack Obama's remark during a 2008 campaign speech comparing certain policy attacks to putting lipstick on a pig sparked unexpected controversy regarding whether it referenced his opponent Sarah Palin. Palin had recently joked at the Republican convention about the difference between a pit bull and a hockey mom being lipstick, leading some commentators and rival campaign staff to interpret Obama's later remark as a targeted jab rather than a common colloquial expression. Obama's campaign insisted the phrase was simply a well-known figure of speech unrelated to Palin whatsoever, noting that similar phrasing had been used by numerous politicians, including Republicans, over the years without controversy. Media coverage debated the question extensively for several days, with commentators questioning whether the outrage reflected genuine offense or simply campaign strategy designed to generate sympathetic coverage. The episode ultimately faded quickly from the news cycle, but it demonstrated how easily innocuous language could become fodder for extended political controversy during an intensely competitive and closely watched campaign season. 89. And speaking of organizations that became unlikely flashpoints in a presidential campaign, ACORN, the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, found itself at the center of intense controversy during the 2008 election cycle. The organization conducted voter registration drives in low-income communities, and several of its employees were found to have submitted fraudulent registration forms, sometimes containing fictional names or duplicate entries. Election officials clarified that voter registration fraud didn't necessarily equate to actual voter fraud, since every submitted registration still required official verification before anyone could cast a ballot. Critics used the scandal to raise broader concerns about voter fraud and organizational oversight, while defenders argued the isolated incidents were being used to discredit legitimate registration efforts serving underrepresented communities. The controversy became a frequent talking point during campaign debates and cable news coverage, disproportionate to the actual scale of confirmed fraudulent registrations. Acorn eventually dissolved in 2010 following additional scandals and funding cuts. The episode remains a frequently cited example in discussions about how isolated administrative failures can escalate into significant symbolic political battles during a heated campaign season. 90. And speaking of private remarks that found their way unexpectedly into public view, the so-called 47% video became one of the most damaging moments of Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign. During a private fundraiser, Romney was secretly recorded suggesting that nearly half of Americans were dependent on government assistance and unlikely to support his candidacy regardless of his positions. When the footage surfaced publicly, it dominated news coverage for weeks, with critics arguing the remarks revealed genuine disdain toward a significant portion of the electorate. Romney's campaign maintained the comments were taken out of context, insisting he had been discussing electoral strategy rather than expressing broader judgment about struggling Americans. The controversy illustrated the growing challenge facing candidates in an era where nearly every gathering carried the risk of being recorded and instantly distributed worldwide. Some analysts consider the incident a significant turning point in a campaign that had already faced difficulty connecting with certain voter demographics. The episode remains frequently referenced in discussions about privacy, technology, and the increasingly permeable boundary between private political candor and public accountability in modern campaigning. 91. And speaking of campaigns that turned data into a genuine competitive advantage, the Obama campaign's data operation in 2012 changed how presidential elections were run from the ground up. Behind the scenes, a team of analysts and engineers built a massive database combining voter files, consumer information, and past campaign contacts into a single system nicknamed Narwhal. They ran constant experiments, testing different messages, different door knock scripts, different fundraising emails to see what actually moved people to donate, volunteer, or vote. This wasn't guesswork anymore. It was closer to a scientific method applied to persuasion. The campaign could identify individual voters likely to be persuadable and target them with startling precision, while ignoring people whose minds were already made up. Romney's campaign attempted something similar with a system called Orca, which famously crashed on Election Day, leaving volunteers without the tools they needed. The contrast highlighted how technical execution had become just as important as message and fundraising. Political scientists and campaign strategists studied the Obama data operation for years afterward, treating it as a blueprint. Every major campaign since has invested heavily in data science, turning voter targeting into a permanent feature of presidential politics. 92. And speaking of foreign policy crises that became campaign battlegrounds, the debate over Benghazi during the 2012 election showed how quickly a tragedy overseas could turn into a domestic political weapon. In September of that year, attackers stormed the U.S. diplomatic compound in Benghazi, Libya, killing Ambassador Chris Stevens and 3 other Americans. In the days that followed, administration officials initially described the attack as a spontaneous response to an anti-Islam video, a characterization that critics argued misrepresented what intelligence agencies actually knew at the time. Republican lawmakers in Romney's campaign seized on the inconsistency, arguing it reflected either incompetence or an attempt to avoid political damage so close to an election. Democrats countered that early intelligence assessments were genuinely uncertain and that criticism was being exploited for partisan advantage during an active national security situation. The controversy dominated a presidential debate and continued for years afterward through congressional hearings that ultimately produced no findings of deliberate wrongdoing. What the episode demonstrated clearly was how a genuine tragedy involving American lives could become entangled with campaign messaging, turning grief and uncertainty into a recurring talking point long after the immediate crisis had passed. 93. And speaking of recordings that arrived at the worst possible moment for a candidate, the Access Hollywood tape became one of the most consequential October surprises in modern campaign history. Released by the Washington Post just weeks before the 2016 election, the recording captured Donald Trump making vulgar remarks about women during a 2005 conversation caught on a hot microphone before a TV appearance. The tape prompted immediate condemnation from members of both parties, with some Republican officials publicly withdrawing their endorsements and speculation swirling about whether Trump might leave the race entirely. Trump apologized, calling the comments locker room talk, before pivoting quickly to attack his opponent's own record regarding past scandals. The controversy dominated news coverage for days and appeared in the very next presidential debate. Despite predictions from many analysts that the tape would prove politically fatal, Trump's support among his base remained largely intact through the following weeks. The episode became a case study in how quickly a campaign could weather scandal when the news cycle moved fast enough and when voters had already made deep partisan commitments before Election Day arrived. 94. And speaking of last-minute developments that scrambled an already unpredictable race, the FBI's handling of the Hillary Clinton email investigation became one of the most debated moments of the entire 2016 campaign. Clinton had faced scrutiny for months over her use of a private email server while serving as Secretary of State, with the FBI eventually concluding in July that no criminal charges were warranted, though Director James Comey criticized her handling of classified information as extremely careless. Then, just 11 days before the election, Comey sent a letter to Congress announcing the discovery of additional emails on a device unrelated to the original investigation, reopening the matter in the final stretch of the campaign. Clinton's campaign argued the timing violated long-standing Justice Department norms against influencing elections so close to voting. 2 days before the election, Comey announced the new emails changed nothing, but by then the damage to news coverage and public perception had already been done. Statistical analyses afterward suggested the announcement may have shifted enough undecided voters in key states to matter. The episode remains one of the most scrutinized moments in the history of law enforcement intersecting with electoral politics. 95. And speaking of foreign involvement extending into the digital spaces where Americans actually spend their time, investigations following the 2016 election concluded that Russian operatives conducted a coordinated social media influence campaign aimed at American voters. Using fabricated accounts and pages designed to look like authentic American groups, operatives linked to the Internet Research Agency created and shared content on divisive social and political issues, sometimes organizing real-world rallies attended by unwitting American citizens. The goal, according to intelligence assessments, wasn't necessarily to support one specific candidate exclusively, but to deepen existing divisions and undermine confidence in the democratic process itself. Congressional investigations and the Mueller report later detailed thousands of these fabricated posts and accounts, reaching millions of users before platforms identified and removed them. Social media companies faced intense scrutiny afterward for failing to detect the operation sooner, prompting new policies around political advertising transparency and foreign account verification. The episode fundamentally changed how Americans think about information itself during elections, introducing lasting public awareness and considerable anxiety about how vulnerable modern democratic discourse had become to organize manipulation from beyond its own borders. 96. And speaking of results that left many Americans questioning how the system actually works, the 2016 election produced one of the starkest divides between the popular vote and the Electoral College in modern history. Hillary Clinton received nearly 3 million more individual votes nationwide than Donald Trump, yet Trump secured the presidency by winning key battleground states by narrow margins, accumulating enough electoral votes to claim victory. It marked the second time in just 16 years that a candidate won the presidency while losing the nationwide popular vote following the 2000 election involving Bush and Gore. The outcome reignited long-standing debates about whether the Electoral College still served its intended purpose in a modern, densely populated nation. Supporters of the system argued it preserved the influence of smaller states and prevented candidates from focusing exclusively on major population centers. Critics argued it fundamentally distorted democratic representation, allowing a candidate to become president without securing more support nationwide. Proposals for reform, including the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, gained renewed attention afterward, though no constitutional change has occurred. The debate remains unresolved, a structural feature of American democracy that continues generating disagreement with every close election cycle. 97. And speaking of campaigns forced to reinvent themselves overnight, the COVID-19 pandemic upended the 2020 presidential race in ways no one had planned for. Traditional rallies, packed convention halls, and door-to-door canvassing suddenly became public health risks rather than campaign strategy. The Biden campaign leaned heavily into virtual events, drive-in rallies, and digital organizing, arguing that responsible campaigning meant limiting crowds. The Trump campaign continued holding large in-person rallies, framing them as a sign of enthusiasm and defiance against pandemic restrictions that critics considered reckless. Both approaches drew criticism and praise depending on who you asked. Volunteers who once knocked on thousands of doors shifted to phone banks and text messaging instead. Fundraising moved almost entirely online, with both parties setting historic records, despite the economic uncertainty gripping the country. Analysts still debate how much the pandemic actually changed outcomes versus simply changing methods. What's certain is that an entire campaign apparatus built over decades around physical presence had to adapt within weeks, proving that even the most established rituals of American democracy could bend when circumstances demanded it. 98. And speaking of voting itself becoming a battleground, the explosion of mail-in ballots during 2020 turned absentee voting into one of the most contested issues of the entire election. With the pandemic making in-person voting risky for many Americans, states expanded mail-in options at a scale never seen before, and tens of millions of voters took advantage of it. Election officials from both parties insisted the process was secure, pointing to signature verification, tracking systems, and decades of successful use in states like Oregon and Washington. Others raised concerns about processing delays, ballot harvesting rules, and the sheer logistical challenge of counting so many mailed votes on a compressed timeline. Legal battles erupted in multiple states over deadlines, drop boxes, and witness requirements, with courts issuing dozens of rulings right up until Election Day. The counting process itself, stretching over days in some states, created an unusual gap between polls closing and results being known, a gap that fueled speculation and distrust in real time. The debate over mail voting security continues today, a lasting reminder of how quickly voting methods can become flashpoints. 99. And speaking of threats that election officials worried about before they even fully arrived, the rise of deepfake technology introduced a new kind of anxiety into the 2020 campaign season. Advances in artificial intelligence made it possible to fabricate remarkably convincing audio and video of candidates saying things they never actually said. Security experts and intelligence officials warned that a well-timed deepfake released just before voting began could spread faster than any fact check could keep up with. Some states passed laws requiring disclosure when political ads used manipulated media, though enforcement remained difficult given how quickly content could spread across social platforms. No major confirmed deepfake scandal defined the 2020 election itself, but the warnings proved less theoretical with each passing cycle, as the technology grew cheaper and more accessible. Researchers noted that even the mere possibility of deepfakes created a secondary problem, giving candidates a convenient excuse to dismiss authentic footage as fabricated. Trust in what voters could see and hear with their own eyes and ears had entered genuinely uncharted territory. 100. And speaking of lawmakers trying to prevent the last crisis from happening again, Congress passed the Electoral Count Reform Act in 2022, directly responding to the disputes and confusion surrounding the certification of the 2020 election. The original Electoral Count Act of 1887 had left ambiguous language about the vice president's role in counting electoral votes, ambiguity that fueled arguments and pressure campaigns in the weeks before January 6th. The new law explicitly clarified that the vice president's role during certification is purely ceremonial, with no authority to reject or delay valid electoral votes. It also raised the threshold required for lawmakers to object to a state's results, making frivolous objections considerably harder to sustain. The bill passed with bipartisan support, a rare moment of agreement in an otherwise deeply divided Congress, reflecting shared recognition that the certification process needed clearer guardrails regardless of which party might benefit in future elections. Supporters called it a quiet but essential fix to protect the peaceful transfer of power. Whether it fully resolves future disputes remains untested, but it stands as one of the most direct legislative responses to the events of that turbulent winter.